Hello folks, I'm Alex, this is Alex Unabridged, and these are my thoughts on Burnt Offerings by Robert Marasco. So welcome back to the channel if that is the case. Yes, some more thoughts on another book from me today. Time to have a look at a cracking haunted house story from the 1970s. Burnt Offerings, of course, by Robert Marasco, and this was from 1973. This is part of my 20th century US and UK horror reading project. This one is one of the US entries, picks, if you like. And I had this as an audiobook. A quick spoiler warning, as usual, before we get started. I'm not going to be discussing any major plot points or the ending or anything like that, but there might be some elements that I talk about that could be considered slightly spoilery, so themes or more general like plot and character kind of progression arcs, things like that. So if you've not read this and you want to go in completely blind to it, then do feel free to click away from this video now and come back to it when you're done. Right, let's get into this then. What is this about? What is Burnt Offerings about? In this, we meet Ben and Marion Rolfe. They are a couple living in New York with their young son, David. And Marion particularly is desperate to escape the heat and the noise of the city for the summer, and spots an advertisement for a holiday rental on Long Island. So she convinces a rather reluctant Ben to go and take a look at this house. When they get there, they find it's a grand but decaying mansion, and the price for the rental for the entire summer seems a little bit too good to be true to Ben. But Marion is immediately smitten with it. The only bizarre condition placed upon their stay by the somewhat creepy owners, Roz and Arnold, is that Marion must agree to bring meals to the estate's reclusive and unseen elderly matriarch, Mrs. Allardyce, who lives in a locked room upstairs. So Ben eventually kind of capitulates to Marion's will, and they take the house for the summer, and they bring along obviously their son David and also Ben's elderly aunt Elizabeth with them. As their stay progresses, the house itself begins to change. It kind of seemingly renews itself, whilst the family subtly starts to break down. And strange and unexplained events, so like moments of memory loss, intense dreams, sudden injuries, things like that, that they mount in a slow but quite relentless way. And so what begins as this idyllic getaway turns into a nightmare, where the true horror really lies not in ghosts or monsters, but in a slow erasure of identity, sanity, and control. So what did I think of this then? Yeah, this was absolutely cracking. This deserves a lot more love, I think, than it typically seems to get. I personally had never come across this one before my good buddy and somewhat of a horror oracle, Troy, suggested it for this project, and huge thanks for that suggestion, Troy, because this was a fantastic piece of horror fiction. Marasco plays with kind of familiar gothic elements in this, sort of the decaying home mansion, sort of secretive inhabitants, the motif of kind of caretaking as a sinister kind of obligation to the house. The horror here isn't just sort of supernatural in undertones. It's largely psychological. It's insidious. It's really personal, actually. There aren't any kind of ghosts or jump scares, no blood, no gore, that kind of thing. That's not about that. Instead, we're given this real sense of dread in the form of tension, unease, and a kind of a very slow, gradual transformation. The house slowly begins to exert its will on the occupants, on the Rolfes, and not through any kind of overt violence or kind of mystical supernatural stuff really, but by wearing them down emotionally, making them kind of fray at the edges. yeah, this is about what happens when kind of reality itself starts to buckle under the weight of something that's kind of deeply wrong, something that you can't quite put your finger on, but you still feel kind of the oppressive nature of, and you feel that, I think, right from the sort of the beginning of the book. Um, the atmosphere in this is I found really claustrophobic. I think Marasco kind of builds one of the most suffocating and therefore unsettling settings that I've encountered in a while. um, yeah, the mansion is a brilliant creation. Not just in its kind of physical presence, its description, if you like, but the way that it evolves throughout the novel. Um, as I say, at first it's decrepit, it's shabby, but kind of charming. It's got a lot of potential, and especially for Marion, she can see that. It's somewhat of a dream come true for her. She loves nice things. She loves like nice furniture and stuff like that. And the house is full of this sort of stuff. So she's, as I say, smitten with it. But as time goes on, as the days pass in the house for the Rolfs, the house seems to kind of feed on the family's energy. So like clocks start to work that previously they couldn't get working. They seemed broken, or like the plants in the greenhouse that were all kind of dead and withered have started to kind of come back to life. And at the same time, the family go the other way. Like Marion first notices, one grey hair, and then more and more. So yeah, it's really effective on that balance between the house kind of getting a new shine, a new life, and the family declining at the same time. Marasco's writing is meticulous. Really, he doesn't show his hand. He kind of just lets you kind of squirm a bit in uncertainty. There is a constant sense that something is off about this house, but it's I don't think it's ever obvious what it is. Ben's the character that really kind of embodies that feeling. He's the one who really feels unsettled about the place from the beginning, and his kind of questioning of it, his kind of own mental state, and how the house makes him feel is I found that quite chilling. As I say, there's no kind of spectacle in terms of blood and gore. Instead, Marasco gives us a very slow progression. There's a kind of a suffocating stillness in many of the scenes that create that tension. It's kind of like that calm before the storm. It's that thick, dense stillness that comes before like the thunder and lightning starts. Marasco uses quite a lot of sort of everyday detail, mundane detail in describing the house and its surroundings, and that kind of grounds everything really well in a very kind of mundane sort of horror. I think what's kind of frightening about this, or unsettling about this book, is that it's not what it tells you, it's what it suggests. It's that as I say, it's that state of uncertainty. And the house itself seems to be watching the Rolfs. It's a character in its own right. It feels quite alive. And Marasco's writing's really effective in creating that sense of being watched, I think, to the point of where when I was reading it, I kind of got that sense of being watched. It's got some really great it has a really great effect, I think, on the reader, or it certainly did for me anyway. I think this is probably one of the most effective psychological horror novels that I've read. The way that Marasco handles kind of the emotional and mental unraveling of each character, but especially Ben and Marion, is chilling. I think Marion's sort of psychological decline is really quite tragic. She's obsessed with the house. She has this kind of compulsive need to care for it, especially the locked room upstairs where Mrs. Allardyce lives. That becomes almost kind of parasitic, her kind of relationship with the house. Ben, on the other hand, he's much more questioning, much more suspicious of what's going on, but still can't quite bring himself to believe that it's anything, supernatural or, kind of weird in that respect. But he experiences kind of moments of uncontrollable rage, and he has some really terrifying visions as well. There's an outstanding and unforgettable scene involving a moment in the swimming pool with his son David. It's basically like a simple summer day suddenly gone very wrong, very sinister. Um, and it kind of goes back to that whole kind of, the mundane becoming terrifying that Marasco, I think, does so well in this. And Ben's own thoughts on that particular scene are quite harrowing as well. He questions whether a violent impulse suddenly came on him from within him or from somewhere else. And it's that kind of ambiguity, that kind of fractured self that lies at the heart of why this is really kind of a great psychological horror. The idea of like so slow mental deterioration of the characters in this becoming kind of puppets in their own bodies, kind of, at the house's will. I think that taps into kind of, fears generally that, a lot of us have. I think we all worry on some level about losing control of our minds, relationships, sense of reality, that kind of thing. And Marasco really amplifies that in this book. And I think one of the most kind of unsettling aspects of this is how quietly it all happens. The characters don't like throw tantrums and have like big drama and stuff like that. They don't have kind of melodramatic breakdowns or anything like that. The changes are incremental, that they're slow and subtle and sort of increasingly creepy. The horror of it all isn't just that something's happening to them, it's by the time they realise what's happening, it might already be too late to stop it. I mean, in terms of characters, this is a small cast that we're spending our time with. It's mostly focused on Marion and Ben, who are strongly written. They're really good characters. But we're also spending some time with Aunt Elizabeth and David, both of whom feel real, and add another dimension to kind of the family dynamic. Aunt Elizabeth, I have to say, was a particularly likeable character for me. She's in her 70s, but she's sharp, she's witty, she brings a bit of sass to proceedings, certainly in the first part of the book. Brings some humour into it for sure. I won't go into any details with what she experiences during the stay at the house, because that would definitely be spoiler territory. But I'll say that the way that Marasco developed her character and how I connected to her because of that certainly made what happens to her particularly impactful to me. I thought she was a great character. So yeah, to wrap this up, I really liked this one. I'm going to put this on Storygraph at maybe a 4-star, maybe a 4.5 star. I haven't quite decided yet. But yeah, this was cracking. If you're a fan of slow burn, psychological tension, kind of an oppressive atmosphere, the sort of horror that kind of sits quite heavily on you, that's kind of unsettles constantly rather than terrifies, that kind of leaves doors open, leaves details open for you to kind of obsess over a little bit, then I think you'd really enjoy this. It definitely crept under my skin in the best way possible. And I'll say that, like, whilst it might not have the same sort of household name recognition of some of, like, say, Stephen King's early works, or even somebody like Shirley Jackson's kind of gothic tales, I think it belongs right up there with that sort of stuff. I think it's an absolutely brilliant haunted house sort of story. Speaking of King, it's really hard not to see echoes of this in The Shining. Where the Overlook Hotel feeds off its inhabitants by exploiting their weaknesses, their psychological weaknesses. It's a hotel that isn't just haunted, but it's sentient. It's not just kind of monstrous, but it's manipulative of the characters. I think it's, you know, there are definite similarities to the mansion in Burnt Offerings in that respect. But where King leans into spectacle, Marasco definitely resists it. I think he's quite restrained in that, and because of that, the horror kind of creeps in. It's subtle at first, and you know, then it becomes all consuming. I'd love for there to be a good back catalogue of other novels by Marasco for me to kind of dig into, but sadly there isn't. He only wrote 2 novels from what I can tell, and from the looks of the other, which is called Parlour Games, that looks like quite a different beast, and not necessarily up my street. He did write some plays, so perhaps I'll give those a try, but it's just a shame that there's not more horror out there from him. But at least with the one that he did write, this one, I think he absolutely nailed it. So there we go. Those are my thoughts on Burnt Offerings. If you are a fan of this kind of haunted house, psychological horror type stuff, and you haven't read it, I absolutely recommend it. But yeah, that'll do from me today. Thank you very much for watching, folks. As always, do drop your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read Burnt Offerings? And if so, what did you think? And also, if there are any other books you can think of that you think I might like based on my thoughts on this one, then do let me know those too. I'll be back soon with another video at some point. So I do hope you'll join me for that, whenever that might be. But from me, for now, that's ta-ra.